All right, chapter 12 of the Conquest of Bread. In this chapter, Kropotkin, he calls this chapter objections, and he claims that what he's going to do is deal with objections, but unfortunately, most of his arguments seem to be largely vulnerable to, it's the fallacy where you take one thing and then go in the wrong direction with it. I forget what the technical term is, but you'll see what I mean as we get into it. So let's get started. First off, in this chapter, the first thing Kropotkin does is he notes that he's not talking about objections to authoritarian communism. He says he's against that too. And we have some evidence, some historical evidence from that. He was reportedly rather unhappy at the Bolshevik Revolution and how it was going. He repeats the fundamental characteristics of anarcho-communism. Number one, absolute liberty of the individual. Number two, no admission of any authority. And number three, no use of compulsion to drive men to work. Now, we're going to find that this isn't actually true in this chapter as well. It's a very weird thing, but the point to think about here is, it was really funny how earlier Kropotkin said that anarchism means communism and vice versa. Well, was he lying then, or is he lying now? If he admits to the existence of an authoritarian communism, then surely it is not true that anarchism and communism are the same thing. And therein lies our escape hatch, basically. That non-communistic anarchism might actually be something. But as we're learning, it's pretty clear that anarchistic communism is, or rather, did I say that right? Non-communistic anarchism may be something, right? But anarchistic communism is pretty clearly a bunch of nonsensical arguments built on a pile of sand. So, here's the first objection that Kropotkin claims to deal with. Quote, if existence is guaranteed, no one will work, end quote. Kropotkin argues that wage work is inferior in quality and wasteful of human energy. He's done this before. He brings up two examples, the freed black slave and the freed Russian serf. He notes that both work harder after liberation, not less. He argues that this proves, essentially, that the more free the laborer, the better the results. He talks about free laborers going out to claim and cultivate previously barren land. He talks about a Swiss canton called Vaud, V-A-U-D, which has a timber festival, or had a timber festival, where everybody went out and chopped down trees and then shared the results, kind of thing. And then he talks about Russian villages farming communally being more productive as well. Basically, he's saying that festivals of labor show results. This kind of formula is missing a few important details. First, it's not just any person that goes and successfully cultivates previously barren land. This is the mistake that the Soviets made with their dekulakization. The kulaks were there for a reason. They were the more efficient farmers. Cutting them off from the land and making it so that the people who were less efficient farmed their land instead reduced productivity. It's always some particular person or persons who have foresight and low time preference who make these advances. In festivals, the festival example isn't very good because in a festival situation, there's great social pressure for everyone to participate. This is a kind of soft power, I guess you could call it. And to compete, honestly. There's competition going on, and that's something that a lot of these communistic theorists kind of mistake competition and cooperation and, aggression. These are three different phenomena. And competition is not the same thing as aggression. And competition and cooperation are actually more closely linked than people think, generally. But, if we look at this timber festival, I couldn't find any easy-to-find sources about this Vaud timber festival. But it's likely that if there were people in the canton who didn't participate, that they wouldn't reap the benefits of their neighbor's labor without good reason. It was likely that there were, if you could show that you had a serious illness and couldn't participate, then maybe people would be like, oh yeah, we'll help you out there, sure, but it's pretty clear that this did not extend. It didn't extend to people outside of Vaud. It was a localized thing, and these localized examples just because there's a localized example of some people for fun, for one day of the year, working together and doing stuff because there's a social pressure to do so, doesn't extend to large groups of people who are not connected by any sort of social pressure, right? This was why fascism appeared from communism, right? The fascists or proto-fascists observed that internationalism was at a dead end, that the Russian worker felt closer to the Russian bourgeoisie than he did the Italian worker. And so these international pushes for workers of the world unite were kind of falling on not deaf ears, but they were at least hard of hearing. And so that's why fascism gave up on internationalism, because they said, all right, well, we'll make sure that all of the Italian workers feel like one collaborative group, and we'll turn, and we know already that they feel closer to the Italian bourgeoisie than the Russian workers. So what we'll do is we'll kind of put the Italian bourgeoisie under our control via heavy regulation, and we'll create a set of propaganda that encourage the workers and the bourgeoisie to kind of, feel better about each other and turn them against their international neighbors. It's also, it may be true that the Russian communal farms on average were more productive than equivalent land under serf labor. That makes sense. If you're enslaved, you don't work any harder than you have to avoid being beaten. But that's not because of some kind of ideal of the more free the better. Because if you're free, in the sense that Kropotkin is using the word free, he's meaning the freedom of what Marx referred to, of being a poet in the morning and a farmer in the afternoon and a singer in the evening or whatever. And he's basically talking about getting rid of the incentives that encourage people to specialize, right? And Kropotkin would put that kind of freedom on his freedom scale, whereas a more sensible look would be to look at the amount of expropriation you have. When the serf was turned to a free communal laborer on a farm, the amount of his product that would be expropriated went down. If it went down further, he might be more productive. But Kropotkin advocates for expropriation, widespread expropriation. And there's no proof that level would not go back up if you try to implement Kropotkin's ideas. Expropriation, to the person being expropriated, to the victim, right? Victim, is something that they would view similarly to taxation. If you spent 4 or 5 hours a day working on a thing and most of it got taken away from you because nobody else was doing as much, or just because there happened to be people who needed it or whatever, it would feel a lot like taxation to the person being expropriated. That's something that Kropotkin doesn't really think about or empathize with. The more expropriation you have, the more taxation you have, probably the worse productivity you're going to have. It's slavery by part, right? You could be the slave who gets room and board, basically, right, for your hard labor, and you get beaten if you don't work hard enough. Or you could be the person who pays a 35% marginal income tax. Well, that's not, those two things are different in degree, but not in principle. Furthermore, it's worth noting that the productivity of Russian communal farms was generally less than farms under even more privatized models. Again, I refer to the kulaks, right? These were people who, I believe they constituted only a few percent of the population, but they were producing 20% of the grain. It was a pretty significant efficiency boost, and that was because of private property, because of the formation of capital, mostly in the form of beasts of burden, right? Cows and goats and stuff. And when you took all that away from them and communalized things more, things got worse, not better. It may be that Kropotkin, we can't blame Kropotkin for not knowing this because it happened in the 1930s and he was writing this in the late 1800s. But now we know, right? And what basically happened is that the people who had the most private property, the people who had accumulated the most private property by way of savings, were the most efficient by far. And when you took things away from them, you reduced productivity, not increased it. So it's also worth noting, and this is something that Kropotkin kind of never talks about because it's devastating to his case. In a laissez-faire free market, people can and do and did voluntarily start communes in a system of private property, contracts and voluntary exchange, laissez-faire free markets. What they can't do is expropriate other owners of capital goods. And of course, this is kind of the nail in the coffin of the whole system. The whole system is dependent on expropriating capital, using it up, and then hoping to be able to expropriate more. It's basically a death cult. So next up, Kropotkin argues that the wage worker is riveted to misery, whereas the free worker hopes for ease and luxury in the future. Of course, if the free worker discovers that all of his gains are lost to expropriation, he'll change his tune eventually, right? Again, people will get together in a dire situation or for a short time and kind of temporarily suppress these incentives, but in the long run, these incentives are going to win out over any idealistic nonsense that Kropotkin wants to spout. So next up, Kropotkin goes back to his argument about manual versus brain labor. It's kind of the distinction between skilled and unskilled labor. Marx uses it too. He argues that these two classes of labor differ in the sense that the manual labor is what people typically want to avoid. It may be true that manual labor has higher disutility on average than brain labor, but disutility of brain labor is still not zero. Therefore, continuing, Kropotkin says that the separation between manual and brain labor must be effectively abolished. He talks about child or unskilled labor and laments, essentially, that they're not paid enough for their work. He brings up dejected wage laborers and who are refusing to work at their maximum capacity because of their low pay. These are certainly phenomena that can occur, but markets and private property actually stand a chance of solving these problems. Communal ownership and expropriation do not. Specialization is vital to increasing production. Employers who consistently underpay their best employees tend to lose them. And this is a market self-correction kind of force, right? The companies that pay more get the better workers and gain more market share. The companies that overpay, they get some good workers, but they get some bad workers, and they overpay them to the point where they either need to pay some of their other workers less, right? Discounted marginal value product, or they start to lose their capitalization. There's all kinds of ways that this can go, but generally speaking, whenever there's an equilibrium in the market pushes against that. Communes don't necessarily do that. There's no reason to expect that they would. It's also worth noting that child labor was eliminated in large part not because of the laws, but because of the proliferation of capital goods and increases in productivity of their parents. There's an interview by Benjamin Powell titled Sweatshops, A Way Out of Poverty, which talks about this thing. I'll put a link in the description, but the real money quote here is this, quote, "The process of development is the best cure for child labor. In countries with average incomes above $12,000, there's virtually no child labor. But for countries whose incomes are below $2,000, more than 30% of children work." Then I skip a paragraph because the next one is more important, I think. Quote, "It's no accident that the United States didn't pass meaningful national child labor legislation prohibitions until 1938. At that time, average per capita income was already more than $10,000. I put in that already by mistake. In 2010 dollars, it was simply codifying what the market process had already achieved." It's worth noting that if you think about the life of a subsistence farmer, right? If the subsistence farmer is only making 101% of what he needs to survive, then there's only that 1% surplus to give to kids. That means that the ratio of non-workers of all kinds to workers can't be more than 1%. Otherwise, somebody's going to end up starving. It's very rarely that tight. Say it's 125%, right? well then, if you have a life expectancy of 40, which is short, but the kind of thing you would expect in a primitive subsistence farming society, perhaps, then you have 10% of the population, kids from 0 to 10, who effectively are able to not work. And as that number goes up, you can kind of extend that childhood longer and longer. At some point, the people generally start aiming for some luxuries for themselves. It becomes very hard to keep up with the need to have that many children when you're making 200, 300, 400% of what you need to survive. And so things start going in other directions. But in general, there is a desire for parents to, give their children the ability to do better than they did. This is something that is pretty natural, and Kropotkin isn't dealing with it in any significant way. He's just saying, well, I'm going to get the order of events wrong, and I'm going to pretend that laws made child labor go away when it did not. So, but anyway, it's kind of silly, because this is a mistake people make a lot, where they say this happened, and therefore it was because of this. It's a post hoc ergo propter hoc kind of fallacy, where if you actually look at the numbers, child labor is on this massive decline, and only when it reaches this low level does this law pass, and the law is not catastrophic because the amount of surplus is already high enough that it can be supported. So the next thing Kropotkin talks about is he outlines the method by which these hypothetical loafers will be dealt with. He says that these voluntary groups will expel them. And this is another giant self-contradiction in this book. Those expelled laborers, they will have any capital or personal goods they have expropriated by the group when they're kicked out. This is worse than simple unemployment, where a person could work a crappy job and save up for some of the capital goods that he might be able to use to work on his own, to start his own business. But in the Kropotkin model, if you can't do that, if you aren't working hard enough, or if people just don't like you, they can kick you out and take everything that you've saved. This is much worse than the free market, actually. Kropotkin does at least say that a voluntary commune might provide some charity to invalids, quote, if we are rich enough, end quote. But the odds of that, namely being rich enough, are fairly low, especially in long term. But wait, this is a contradiction, because he said earlier that food, clothing, and dwellings will be for all. Not only that, this is the commune expelling a member who's not pulling their weight, or who is perceived as not pulling their weight, is exactly the same as an employer firing an employee for refusing to work, but it's worse, because the commune takes all their stuff and kicks them out naked into the street. The employer can't do that. Apparently, these voluntary associations don't actually have to worry about it either, because they just get to expropriate, and hold capital goods. Now, this is weird, because right, he said property is the robbery, right? Property is robbery is Proudhon, but Kropotkin agrees with Proudhon, at least as far as that goes. But what he's doing is he's carving out an exception for voluntary communes to own property, including capital goods, which is, again, completely self-contradictory. There's absolutely no reason why these voluntary associations have more of a right to own things than an individual. An individual could just be called a voluntary association of one. So we're back to private property. We can't get rid of private property and still remain actually anarchistic. What ends up happening is that the commune effectively acts as a state in confiscating the goods of a person who is seen as undesirable. This is just capitalism, but with more theft. It's funny to see it fall apart like this, where he just basically makes a stupid carve-out for voluntary associations, and they can hold property, but individuals can't. It's nonsensical. It's worth noting that around here, Kropotkin starts to wander off and kind of babble a little bit. He's kind of implying that in his society there will be no guards or judges or policemen in his anarcho-communistic society. This is, of course, more baseless utopianism. Even if this method of production wasn't seriously hampered by a lack of methods to perform economic calculation, more in the Misesian sense than the Hayekian sense, this does not imply that predatory behavior between people will simply vanish in either micro or macro senses, right? There will be predatory communes that try to expropriate things from other communes, stuff like that. After this, Kropotkin returns to his nonsense about making workplaces pleasant. He writes, quote, "If a Huxley spent only 5 hours in the sewers of London, rest assured that he would have found the means of making them as sanitary as his physiological laboratory," end quote. Again, these things can be accomplished, but at a cost. The complex interplay of wages, including compensating differentials, capital goods, which will dwindle and cease to exist in Kropotkin's system, and comfort, which can be achieved but only at a cost, and sometimes at a much greater cost. It's going to be really hard to make the sewers not smell bad. These things are all better left to markets because they permit various solutions to be tried in order to serve different types of customers. Kropotkin's making like a compound mistake here. First, he argues against variations in wages as a method to encourage people who are less squeamish to accept less comfortable jobs. But then he acts as if all people are exactly as squeamish as everybody else, and so he kind of wipes away this vast variety of preferences that people actually have in favor of what he considers to be an ideal solution, of which finally he ignores the real costs. He basically says, everything needs to be pleasant and wonderful, and we're going to have to spend all the capital that it takes to do that, even if we don't possess it. It's suicidal. Finally, in this chapter, Kropotkin laments that conditions of forcefulness turn people into idlers by forcing them to learn things they are uninterested in or to work on things they find unfulfilling. There are certainly cases where this is the problem, but usually this is in cases of government schooling and not, free schooling. The free market solves this problem beautifully by ways of compensating differentials, competition between employers, the free ability to own capital goods securely, and go into business for yourself. Central planning does not do any of these things. It just basically allows the biggest groups to steal all the things they think they need, and leave everybody else destitute in the name of some kind of elimination of property, which is impossible because consumption implies property ownership. If this is what Kropotkin considers to be answers to objections to his system, he hasn't answered any of the really important ones, and his answers to the ones that he's pretended to answer are really, really bad. So, I don't know. This is pretty... I've said before how Mises talks about anarcho-communism and these ideas are not even worth a moment of your time, and I was hoping that Kropotkin would prove me wrong, but so far he has failed to do so. This is nonsense. He eliminates property. He has groups expropriate it, call themselves voluntary associations, despite their reliance on expropriation, and then says that they can hold property, whereas individuals cannot, and any commune can, for any reason, kick out any member, whether he's working or not, just because they don't like him or whatever. And he doesn't get anything. They say, well, if we're rich enough, you'll get the stuff that you're entitled to. But earlier he was saying that everybody is entitled to these things, and now he's carving out these holes, that these entitlements, food, clothing, dwellings, only apply to people who are members in good standing of these voluntary associations, which basically is just the state with extra steps. Yeah, he's basically showing off how the market is better than his system in every conceivable way. So with that, I'll call it here for today. Next week we will move on, chapter 13. Maybe I'll find that he goes abstract again, and I'll be able to do more than one chapter in a week. But we'll see. So with that, I'll say thanks for watching, thanks for listening. If you like the channel and you like what I'm doing, you know what to do. And see you next time, and have a good week.